Romans 12:13 includes the phrase practice hospitality, and usually when we hear that verse, especially in the Western church, we think of putting cookies and coffee out after a Sunday service, or maybe in someone's home after a Bible study, creating a warm, friendly environment for fellowship, mostly with people we know. But when the Apostle Paul actually exhorts us to practice hospitality, he is coming from a biblical understanding of hospitality, which includes an ancient world understanding of hospitality, and that's really vastly different from the cookies and coffee perspective of that. When we look at Scripture and examine Scripture, what we see is that biblical hospitality is actually very costly to the host, and it involves deep service to the need of vulnerable people and a significant care and provision for those people. For instance, in Genesis 18, we have the story of the three visitors that come to Abraham and Sarah's tent. Now, these visitors are travelers, and in the ancient world, travelers were very vulnerable people. They didn't travel because they wanted to go on vacation or they wanted to take a quick trip. Traveling was engaged because of usually some kind of crisis or significant event, some deep need. And so people engaged in traveling, and it was difficult and it was arduous and long. And generally travelers were very vulnerable to physical harm, to hunger and starvation, to dehydration, to isolation, really even death. And so they needed the care and provision of people along the way who would provide for them, embrace them, and really fill any kind of need that they had for food, water, shelter, protection, the inclusion in community relationships. So when the visitors come to Abraham and Sarah immediately identify them as vulnerable travelers and vulnerable people who were in need. And they extend the kind of ancient and biblical hospitality that we're talking about. They invite them in, they prepare a meal for them, they slaughter the best calf in their herd, they give them water, they encourage them to stay, they embrace them, they extend all those aspects of hospitality that were actually quite costly for Abraham and Sarah. That's the biblical understanding of hospitality, sacrificial embrace and provision for people who are in need and particularly vulnerable at that time. Another great example is the whole book of Ruth. Ruth is an immigrant. She's a foreign widow, and when she returns to Israel with her mother-in-law, she's poor. She has no options for work. She has no access to the means of production or the means of a livelihood. She's at risk for exploitation, for physical harm, for poverty, long-term poverty. And yet Boaz recognizes her need, and he extends this same kind of biblical and ancient hospitality. He invites her to glean in his fields, encourages her to stay in his fields in particular, so she doesn't have to go to other people's fields and glean and go behind the harvesters. He embraces her. He brings her into kind of his group of women servants, so gives her a community of sorts. He actually tells the harvesters to pull out stalks and leave them for her so that her harvest is actually increased while there is a cost to Boaz. He protects her physical safety, communicates clearly to the harvesters they are not to lay a hand on her. So he goes above and beyond kindness and above and beyond even what the law requires to show that kind of biblical hospitality, which is the sacrificial, costly embrace of someone who is in need and provision for vulnerable people. A New Testament example is Mark 6 and the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus, after a whole day with the masses of crowds, recognizes their need. They're fatigued, they're hungry, they're thirsty, and so he asks the disciples to gather all the resources that they have and to put those to use in serving those who are in need and who at that point were experiencing some vulnerability. The thing I like about that story is that it reminds us that all of our resources, whether those are financial or time or access to structural systems or access to the means of production or livelihood or social connections, all of those things can and should be used in this service of biblical hospitality. And then the last ultimate example of biblical hospitality is, of course, Jesus at the Last Supper. He's surrounded by the tangible elements of hospitality, bread and wine and a meal, and he uses uses those elements to communicate and to represent this ultimate act of a host giving up of oneself for the guests. So he is the ultimate example of biblical hospitality, providing for the needs of those who are vulnerable and embracing them. So the next time you hear the phrase practice hospitality, go ahead and put out the cookies and the coffee, that's fine. But know that the kind of biblical hospitality that the biblical writers are calling us to goes much beyond kindness, but it gets close to justice. It is a sacrificial and costly embrace of people and a provision for their needs, especially those who find themselves in vulnerable situations.